Welcome and thank you for spending a little bit of your afternoon with me. Today we're going beyond best practices in QuickBooks Online and talking just about bank feeds and reconciliation. And hello, I'm Valerie Heckman. I'm a senior product consultant with Intuit's Small Business Group working in our accountant segment. I've been with Intuit about 6 years. That'll be 7 come December. I'm located in Naperville, Illinois, so I'm right in the middle of the country today. And my role is to really work alongside our accountant segment to help educate bookkeeping, accounting, and tax firms as they move to the cloud and become what we call a firm of the future. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I'm at @VHeckman, and I tweet a lot about things going on with QuickBooks and the accounting industry and apps and all of that good stuff. And I've been a little quiet on Twitter, so hopefully if I get some new followers, that'll help motivate me to post more and give some tips and tricks and those types of things. Okay, so let's get to it. We've got a lot to talk about. Today we're going through the bank feed and reconciliation workflows in QuickBooks Online. I'm going to cover the actual workflow end-to-end of what it looks like to bring transactions into QBO, work with them in the bank feed, and reconcile them. We'll talk through some steps and suggestions, best practices around connecting up your bank accounts, and what it actually looks like to either match or add transactions in the bank feed, including utilizing the very powerful bank rules to fine-tune and automate that process even further. This is my favorite topic in QuickBooks Online, so I'm very excited to share a lot of information on it with you today. I consider bank feeds the first leg of reconciliation, so we're getting the transactions into the books and then diving into the actual steps behind reconciling these accounts once we have our transactions entered. We'll talk a little bit about handling any discrepancies if your clients go in and change something, what you'll see when you're looking at a reconciliation discrepancy page. And then we'll talk through the reports and some of the accountant functionality that's there for you. Why do we use the bank feeds in QuickBooks Online? So this will be helpful for those of you who haven't even been in here before and maybe review for others. The big thing is reducing manual data entry. And when I say bank feeds and banks throughout this webinar, I'm talking about financial institutions. So that can be your checking accounts, savings accounts, credit cards, all of that connected up. So we are connecting up these financial institutions, bringing in those transactions, and we can work with them to either match against what's already in the books or add straight from the bank feed. As we're doing that, these transactions are getting marked as cleared in the register. And so it's really helping us with the reduction of data entry and improving the accuracy of data because we're actually working with the information from the bank. So unless the bank's got something strange going on, this is what actually happened in real life and we're working with that information. It really helps you keep your clients' files up to date as possible. People who really successfully use the bank feeds, love working with the bank feeds, are able to not be historians. They're able to actually proactively look at what's going on in QuickBooks Online and know that we've got transactions as current as possible as we're adding and matching in the bank feed. So hopefully that makes sense. And then when you've got these accounts connected up, you can actually see the balance at the bank versus what's in QuickBooks, what's in the register on the QBO dashboard. And I love thinking of that QBO dashboard as a place to see the health of the business. And we can even pull that up from anywhere, right? So your clients can pull up QuickBooks Online on their mobile devices, their phones, or tablets, and actually get that snapshot of what's going on right from their dashboard, whether it's the bank feed stuff or their invoices and expenses and so on. So that's a major benefit. And then my favorite, and we'll see this a bit today, is making reconciliation faster. Because as we're using the bank feeds, we're really completing that first leg. So I'm going to jump in the product in a moment, but I did want to talk through the banking and reconcile workflow so that you get an idea of what this looks like end to end. First things first, those transactions are going to post to the bank website. I'm going to talk through how you form the connections to get the data in there. But really, that's all around updating the bank feed in QuickBooks. Whether we've connected directly up to that bank account or we're using a file upload to bring transactions in, and I'll talk through both of those methods, we're bringing the data in, and it's sitting in the For Review tab. The transactions are ready to review and accept. What QuickBooks does in the background is take all of that bank data and figure out, hey, is there a possible match? Is there a bank rule that you've set up that tells QuickBooks how you'd like to treat this transaction? Is there anything that we recognize from past behavior? So if I told it that Nationwide was insurance last month, it's going to make that suggestion if the same type of transaction comes in this month. We'll look at some ways to really fine-tune and work with that when we get into the product. And then it also looks for transfers between one asset account and another. Then you come in. You're going to accept those transactions into QuickBooks either by matching or adding. Matching is really about finding something that already exists in the books. Maybe that's a check that was written. Maybe that's an open bill or invoice that we're matching a payment up against. Maybe it's a payment that's been recording and we're just matching payment on the QuickBooks side to payment on the bank side. Or we are just leveraging the bank data and actually adding straight from the bank feed. As we do this, like I said, things are moving into QuickBooks Online. They're going from that bank feed review tab into QuickBooks and getting marked cleared in the register. And then finally, some time goes by. At the end of a monthly period, we're using that bank statement to verify that the cleared transactions actually reflect what we see on the bank's record, so that statement that you get from your clients. So hopefully that's helpful to kind of see the workflow end to end. And of course, we would repeat this for every bank or credit card account. It looks like a lot of steps, but when we get in there, I think you'll see that it really isn't that bad. Okay, so before we get into connecting accounts, I just want to give a little bit of a tour in the product. And if somebody wants to just confirm that you're still seeing my screen, that would be awesome. I think you are. Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, so I'm on the home dashboard. For those that haven't been in QuickBooks Online a lot, I am in as an accountant user. That's why you see this QB accountant in the corner. I've toggled into my client, Heckman Studios, and the dashboard's giving me the overall bird's eye view of what's going on in their books, including the bank accounts. So I have already connected up some accounts here. I see each of those, the balance at the bank versus what's in QuickBooks. These are test accounts, so the numbers get a little funky. But we'll also see how many transactions are waiting to review, waiting for me to match or add them, and the last time it updated and pulled new information in. Now you'll see some of these accounts have a lot of transactions waiting for me to review. A few of them are completed. If I've never connected up a bank account before, the only option I typically see here is the connect accounts. And then any of these that don't show this in QuickBooks stuff are just asset accounts that have balances in my register. So this will match up with those asset accounts in the chart of accounts. Now, if you've already got some accounts connected up, I know 75% of you have used this before. A quick tip, if you don't like the order that this stuff is in, if you hit the pencil, you can rearrange these, kind of move them around, get them the way that you'd like. However you order them in here is how they'll also be ordered when we go into the banking menu. So keep that in mind. It's going to change the order in both places. So this is the banking menu. And I mentioned before, I've already connected up accounts, but I am going to walk you through the steps of what that looks like. Along the very top of the banking tab, we see cards that represent each account that we've connected up. And this can be across different financial institutions, right? So if you've got a client that has, 3 or 4 accounts at Chase and 2 at Bank of America and a bunch of different Visa and MasterCards for different retailers or whatever, you can connect all of those up and you have the option to sort of toggle between them along the top on the cards. I can also collapse this if I want to give myself more space and just use this drop down to toggle. So my client's got like 5 different types of bank accounts connected up. Another note on pencils. So these are in the order that they show up on my dashboard. If I click the pencils here between each card, for connected accounts, I see the option to edit my sign-on info or edit the account info, and that'll actually bring me into that account entry from my chart of accounts where I could make some changes to the name or what have you. Now, if I'm using what we call the file upload method instead, those cards are going to show a 0 bank balance, and then they'll show the last sort of date that things were brought in. And when I click the pencil on one of those, it actually shows this as a file upload instead of a connected account where I'm actually editing the sign-on info at the bank. That's going to make a little bit more sense on the next slide here. So there's two options for bringing bank data into QuickBooks Online. Either connecting the financial institution to QuickBooks or doing a file upload, which is a manual process. If we're connecting the financial institution, we're choosing the bank, we're following some steps to actually enter the login information that would be used for online banking and authenticate the account from a security standpoint. And these steps can kind of vary by bank. I'm going to use Chase as an example in the next couple of slides, but you might see some different screens depending on the financial institution. We connect with, I think, over 14,000 different financial institutions, so they all do things a little bit differently. Then you're mapping the accounts, and the bank is going to be connected going forward. And all you have to do is click the update button to refresh the bank feed and pull anything in from online banking. Essentially, QuickBooks is scraping that data from the bank website and putting it into QuickBooks. That's a very simple way of explaining the process, but you can kind of think of it that way. The file upload, that's where you're actually getting a file and doing things kind of the old-fashioned way. Still more automated than entering line by line in the register, but still a little bit more manual. So that's where you would go to the bank's website, download history. Every bank puts that in a different spot on the website, it seems. Some of them let you download more stuff than others. But we do support CSV, QBO, QFX, and OFX file formats. And then when we're in the banking tab, and I'll show you this when we get there, there is an option under that update menu to do a file upload and map the fields, which you mostly have to do for CSV because sometimes the bank will put the debits and credits in separate columns and sometimes it puts them together. And then each time you want to update the bank feed, you'd have to go out, get that file, bring it into QuickBooks. All right, when we go to connect a financial institution, so we're connecting up an account, the first thing we see is the option to choose the financial institution, to choose the bank or credit card. You can choose from one of the popular ones or start typing the name of a bank. When in doubt, use the same URL here that you'd use to sign into online banking. And this might be something, I'm saying this might be something that you're having your client go through and do because maybe you don't have login information for that account. So I would put in wellsfargo.com or whatever address I use. If you search and it doesn't find the bank, make sure you're typing the name correctly. Type fewer words. If you start typing a name, sometimes some different options will drop down for you. And again, sometimes just copying and pasting the sign-on address for that online bank account can be really helpful because some banks have a lot of different sign-on pages depending on what type of account you have. If the bank's not found, you can request that we add a connection. We are constantly looking to add more connection options to QuickBooks Online. Now, these steps may vary depending on the bank that's chosen. Again, I'm just using Chase as an example, so you might see some different stuff here. And we've done some updates recently for some of the major financial institutions. So maybe some of you have gone through and connected a Chase account before, and this looks a little different now. That's okay. It's all in the interest of really improving our connectivity and having a stronger bond so that you don't run into any sort of weird stuff going forward. Okay, so, and keeping things more and more secure, right? The banks are constantly looking to keep that data safe, so they have you do some extra stuff, like proving that you're not a robot. And then you might have the bank menu kind of pop open in a separate tab to sign in. So Chase has updated their process. They actually have you sign in and verify the account in many cases. So you get a text message or an email. Financial institutions might change depending on what their process is. And in this case, Chase is asking you, hey, are you going to give Intuit QuickBooks access to the account details and the balances and transactions, just to bring that data in, right? We're not actually making deposits or paying bills or anything like that. It's just pulling in the information, and your client might have multiple accounts under that one login to connect up. Then it takes a few moments to form that connection, and the important part here is determining the date range for initial download. Now, this is another thing that's kind of in the process of changing for some of the financial institutions. They're getting more particular on what they share with a third party, and in this case, QuickBooks is that third party, right? So they just want to be very sensitive to how much data they are bringing in. But for most banks, the default is 90 days of transactions when you're forming this initial connection. You can choose a shorter time period, and like you're seeing here, we're mapping up whatever accounts we've chosen to their GL account in QuickBooks. Now, you might be saying, why would I ever want fewer transactions, Val? I want more and more and more. Well, you may want to base this choice, especially if you're connecting to a account in QuickBooks that already exists in the GL. You might want to make this choice based on your last reconciliation. Because the bank feed is sort of that first leg of reconcile, we don't want to add anything in that's already been reconciled, right? Because that would be duplicating things up. So if this account's been reconciled recently, we might choose to say, hey, just bring in 7 days or 30 days or 0 if we know that we have everything from the end of August to the present or something like that. So keep that in mind. And then here's that alternative option, the file upload, where you actually download the details from the bank. CSV is probably the most popular format, but the .QBO, QFX, OFX. This gets used most commonly if the bank doesn't have a connection option for QuickBooks Online, or if you want to bring in a file that's larger than 90 days. So in getting ready for this webinar, I went out and got client data for January till the end of August and pulled it all in at once and did some batch coding and things to get everything in there. Or maybe you want a very specific time period, right? You take on a new client and they say, oh, my books are up to date as of, I don't know, the end of tax season, but they're missing some stuff. You might have a need to bring in a specific period. And then as a backup method, and work with support if you've got some sort of connectivity thing going on with your bank. We certainly work to report and resolve those as quickly as possible, but if there is any sort of downtime, sometimes people will bring transactions in through a file in the interim. Okay, now we're getting into matching and adding. And I've already kind of previewed this a little bit, but when we get those transactions into the review tab, few things happen. First, QuickBooks looks to see if it can find a match of a transaction you've already entered in. And that's essentially, we say reconcile on this screenshot, but really it's marking it as cleared as you match, not doing a full reconcile, but reconciling them against each other. Those typically show up with one similar record found or maybe two. You'll see that a little bit in my clients' books. User rule. If we don't find a match, we look to see if there's a rule you created, and then you would add to approve those transactions. And then the QuickBooks rules, and this is what we call recognized transactions. And that's where if you did something in the past, QuickBooks uses its machine learning to remember that and make that suggestion going forward. If we don't find any of those things, we might make an intelligent guess, right? We see Starbucks, we think, well, if we look at your general ledger, that's probably a travel meal. Those show up in black instead of green. So the green is where QuickBooks has remembered what you did before. The black is a suggestion based on what we might know about that vendor or customer that we're seeing in the payee field. And then if we have no idea what it is, uncategorized expense, uncategorized income. Okay, so this account was updated 6 hours ago. If I wanted to, I could click update. I can go do other things and come back here. It'll cycle through and refresh the accounts. If I needed to do a file upload, I would do it from here. So that's where that drop down is. And if I was adding an account, I'd click that button. So you can connect additional accounts if you think of them. Say, oh yeah, my client has a Home Depot card or something that we forgot they had. We could go through and see if that's an option and connect that up. Okay, so you can sort this in a variety of different ways, the review tab here. I could sort by date, description, payee. Personally, I sort by category or match because I like to look at these in the order of how QuickBooks has kind of looked at them, right? It looked for matches first, then it looked for rules, and then it gets down into some additional suggestions. You could sort them by spend to received. If I go under the small gear, I can configure this table further. Keep that in mind throughout QuickBooks Online if you're fairly new to the product. Anytime you see one of these small gears, you can configure a table. So maybe I have a client that writes a lot of checks. I don't, but if I did, I might add the check number column. Payee column's optional. Editable date field. I actually got a great question on this earlier today. That is if you wanted to overwrite the date that the bank pulled in. So this will typically match up with when the transaction cleared, but maybe if you're adding straight from the bank feed, you want to do the date that that check was written, for example. So that's a setting here. Copy bank detail to memo. I like to keep that one turned on because that actually takes the information that QuickBooks got from the bank and drops it into the memo field. When we get into Reconcile, you'll see that that's super helpful to be able to cross-reference later. Remember category selection. For those that have been using the bank feeds for a while, this is a fairly new setting that you can turn off, and it will stop remembering how you coded the transactions. So I used the example before. If I told it that Nationwide was insurance last month, it might suggest that the next time. If I turn this off, it won't. It might still make one of those intelligent guesses and say insurance because it knows Nationwide might be that. But this kind of prevents it from remembering bad behavior. So some clients might have business types where the category really changes drastically, even with the same payee from time to time, from each transaction to the other one. And so that's a way to kind of turn off it remembering that. But I can also set up bank rules to fine-tune it. And then finally, show bank details. That will change this kind of cleaned up QuickBooks description that we're seeing here into the actual details from the bank. And that, to me, is a little hard on the eyes. But if you've got a bank that the cleaned up QuickBooks description isn't really doing enough for you, rather than having to click and expand to see that bank detail, you could just turn on that setting in the gear, and we can, turn this on and off to have that option show. All right, that brings me into this area. I'm looking to see if there's any questions. Seems like we're doing well so far, I hope. If a record is found, we can click to actually look at that transaction that it's trying to pair up against in QuickBooks. So I could take a peek at that check and say, yep, that's the one. X out of that and match those together. As I match and add, they move from For Review to the In QuickBooks tab. So I can always go back in here and see what I just did. And if I think I made a mistake, I could undo it and it'll put it back for me. All right, if we don't find a match, we look at the rules. I'm going to come back to the rules in just a moment, I promise. If I'm categorizing and actually adding instead of matching, so my client does a lot of, debit and credit card. It's not even swipes anymore, right? We're inserting the chip. They do a lot of things on the go. They've got a lot of, transactions that are on the fly. Maybe they're not recording every single thing into QuickBooks as they do business. So I might say, okay, well, this is a travel gasoline, or maybe this was something else. As I'm coding these transactions, this is QuickBooks remembering. So when I choose a category from my chart of accounts, so I chose a sub-account of travel expense, when I choose that, here's where it shows that QuickBooks is remembering that this bank description should be coded that way. Now, I can edit this setting and say, hey, you know what? Leave that uncategorized. I want to decide what that is every time it comes through. Or I can create a custom rule and set some conditions for how QuickBooks will treat that transaction as it comes through. We'll get to the rules in a moment. I'm creating a lot of suspense for the rules. As we are expanding these out, we would choose the payee here, the category. Some of the things that show up here depend on what's turned on or off in the settings. So I'm in a QuickBooks Online Plus file, and I have billable expenses turned on, so I can mark something billable and assign it to a customer. I'm also using class and location tracking, so I could choose my class here and my location if I needed to as I'm going through, if any of that is applicable. So now I've matched and added some transactions. Let's talk about these rules. So as you saw, I can create bank rules as I go, or I can go up to the Bank Rules tab and see any rules that I've created and create them from scratch from here. And rules are really exciting. So creating and managing rules, I'm going to just pull up a quick slide here on this. It really goes beyond that automatic memorizing and categorizing that QuickBooks Online does as it learns. What this ends up doing is actually scanning the bank feed and applying the rules so that, like my screen, you can actually review those rules and have some of this stuff assigned so that it's just a review and submit. Maybe make a couple of tweaks before you add the transaction. It's really allowing you to set some conditions and set not just the category, but also the payee, class, location, even what's in the memo field, even split by dollar amount or percentage. And you can set rules up to actually automatically add transactions to the books, further automating this whole process. And I always say, use that with caution. Maybe you've got a client that has very consistent same transactions all the time. Maybe they're using vendors where there's one thing that comes in and they're like, wow, if we set some conditions around it, there's nothing else that this could be. You only apply one rule per transaction, and you can prioritize the rules in this bank rules window. All right, somebody asked, how do we fix something we've matched but later find out that it has been matched to the wrong invoice? So that would be done a couple of different ways. So if I'm in the bank feed and I make a mistake in the moment, I can go to In QuickBooks and find that and undo. If I am in that transaction later, so here we'll look at this check. So if I'm looking at this check later down the road, I get here from a report or somewhere else in QuickBooks, I can always see the online banking match in the upper left-hand corner, and I'd have the option to unmatch from there as well. Going back to the bank rules. So I've created a lot of rules already. What this really has allowed me to do is when I connect up an account, I've got rules in place, and it's going to just go through those transactions and apply my rules right away. And then anything that new that comes in, it looks at those rules first if it doesn't find a match before it starts making suggestions. So it kind of sits in between that we found a match or we recognize a category to see if there's anything that you've customized to fine-tune that even further. So let's look at a couple of these possible rule ideas. You can really get creative with these. We give the rule a name. We indicate if it's for money in or money out, and choose what bank accounts we want that rule to apply to. So maybe a transaction is treated differently if it comes through on a checking account versus a credit card. It might depend on your client. Then we set our conditions, and we can do a combination of things here and choose to have the conditions be any or all of them met in order to have QuickBooks do the following. So I have looked at my client and noticed that they have a storage rental charge that comes through every month. They pay it online. It's always the same, and they never think to enter it as a bill that's due later because it's just an automatic thing for them. On whatever day of the month, it pulls out $66.82. So I looked at the bank text and said, all right, bank text contains this description every single time. Maybe there's some other codes or numbers or city, state, or something that we might include here. But I'm going to say if it contains this and the amount, and I could go off of that bank text, that cleaned up QuickBooks description, or the actual amount. And I have said if the bank amount, equals $66.82, we're going to do the following. And you could do greater than, less than, doesn't equal, and contains, doesn't contains is exactly for the words and potential codes or whatever here. I figured out that this rule works really great for this particular transaction. And so I've said, if it meets all of these conditions, life storage, $66.82, have QuickBooks add this in as an expense, right, because we chose money out. The payee is life storage, and I've actually decided to split this by percentage across two different classes. I could split it by dollar amounts. I could split class and category, or one or the other. Sky's kind of the limit here, and we can split up to 20 lines. And then the final option is if I want this to automatically add to the books. If I leave that unchecked, I actually get that opportunity on the Review tab to look at the rule that's been assigned and make sure it jives with the transaction. If I have it automatically add to the books, it bypasses that review page and puts it straight into QuickBooks. And you might have seen this a little bit when we were in my review area. So this is a rule that I set up that I said, okay, I'm going to have it automatically add. Kind of a silly example, but you can probably think of something your client has that costs exactly the same every month, or something that is, hey, if it's under $20, do we really need to look at that 7-Eleven expense coming through? And I'm using expenses as my kind of primary transactions here, but this can apply for money in as well. Another type of rule that I really love to see is catch-all rules, and that's kind of a Val Heckman name. That's when I say, hey, if it's any of these conditions, fill in some of this stuff. And if you create a rule and you don't have it fill in every single area, as long as you don't have it automatically adding, you still get the option to kind of go through and fill in some of these things if you'd like. So I said, all right, if it's any of these sort of taxi brands or rideshare or whatever, have it at least fill this in as an expense and travel and transportation. And maybe I have a class that I would have it assign as well, so that my client isn't constantly having to go through and make sure that they code those correctly. Is it going to remember if I tell it that Uber is travel and transportation? Sure, but it's not going to constantly remember that class. And if she accidentally teaches it something else, like she teaches it that Uber is a office supply or something, an office expense, then this can prevent that from continuing to be a problem going forward. So even if you like how QuickBooks Online has learned the transactions, the bank rules really let you lock in things that should always be coded a certain way. Hope that helps. So these are the rules that I get a chance to review and make sure that there's nothing else that I wanted to add here. I can always look and see which rule was applied as well. And then the automatic add, they bypass the Review tab and go straight into QuickBooks. So there's that Netflix one. And this little icon with the plus in front of it indicates that that was an automatic add from the bank feed. Okay, a few other things that I want to make sure you know in here. And I could talk about just the bank feeds all afternoon, but I want to make sure we have time for reconciliation and any questions that you might have. Few other things that are great to know. Batch actions. If I wanted to select some of these, if I've already said, yep, this is what they match up against and we're cool, I can accept those all at once. If I hold down the shift on my keyboard, I can grab a whole bunch of stuff at the same time and accept it in too. So I might use that for things like my rules or my matches. Now, if I've perhaps sorted things by description and I want to make sure that I'm coding some like stuff together, so maybe my client's a little backdated here and we want to add some transactions in batch, we might say, all right, let's grab all these Best Buy ones and modify selected to actually choose Best Buy as the payee, and maybe I'm pretty confident that these are all office supplies, and maybe I code those as a certain class, whatever. I can apply those settings and then accept those in together too. So lots of different ways that you can sort of sort this. When I see people do like the file upload method, if they're bringing in a whole year, maybe they do sort by description or by the payee to do some of that in batch, and it really saves you some time. And the rules, of course, could save you time too. I didn't mention this, but there is an option to export rules out and import them into another company. So maybe you have a client that's multiple entities, you've got multiple QuickBooks Online accounts. Once you set up the rules in one, you might export them out and import them into the other. I know a firm up in Washington that they created rules, like 10 or 15 rules that they use for every real estate client, because it seemed like they all had the same set of vendors, a pretty similar chart of accounts, or maybe the same, and it'll guide you through mapping it up against those things like the vendor list, etc. when you go through. And then the last kind of little piece here is excluded. And I reserve excluded for things that might be duplicates. So let's say the client connected up their account and they brought in, 90 days, or they did a file upload, they brought in some stuff that we know has already been reconciled. Since it's not going to match against things that have already been reconciled, we might say, hey, you know what, I'm going to grab these 2 transactions from April and exclude them because we know they're already in the books. Maybe I choose to have my register open in another tab. So I'll duplicate my tab. There's a little shortcut here to go to the register. Maybe I look through my register to see, hey, is this already here as I'm going through and adding and matching? If something does show up in the register that you say, well, it didn't find a match in the books, why might that be? You can actually click on the transaction, click Find a Match, and we look through the books to see if there is something that this might pair up against. So maybe, and I'm realizing this might not be the best example, but maybe this transaction was actually this check, and they entered it in for 100, but the transaction that came through the bank feed is 99. Perhaps we need to actually open up that check and make an edit. There is an option to resolve the difference through here, but personally, if it's a dollar amount match, I might want to go through and edit the original rather than entering another transaction to resolve the difference. But, sometimes if it's something like a processing fee or something like that, it might make sense to just have that be a secondary transaction that you resolve. So if you've got a client that's really entering things into the books as they go and it's not pulling a match, use that Find Match tool to see if it's a dollar amount difference. That's really the top thing that I see as differences. Sometimes a transaction was recorded as a check, but when the transaction comes through the bank feed, it's ACH, and it doesn't necessarily realize that that's a check because it wasn't entered in that way. So things like that might cause a not pulling a match, but for the most part, it is pretty smart, and it'll say that it found those records. Okay, let's get into reconciliation. Okay, so I talked about how reconciliation is really the second leg of this process, right? Bank feeds first, and then we're going to compare that monthly bank statement against what's in QuickBooks Online, and we know that the bank account and the books will agree when the difference between them is 0. Here's what that leg of the workflow looks like. Bank's going to deliver that monthly statement, and somehow you retrieve that from your client. If you're taking care of the reconciliation for them, of course, they might be doing these steps. And then before you even go into the Reconcile tool, it's a good idea to stop off in the bank feed and make sure that everything for that period that's on the bank statement has been accepted in yet. You don't want anything sitting there for review that you're going to try to reconcile, right? Because it might not be in there, or if we reconcile it first, we might not get that chance to match the transactions. And that's another reason sometimes people end up excluding. If they did the reconcile first and then they go back into the bank feed and go, oh shoot, we didn't add things from the bank feed, we've got to exclude those out. So ideally, best practice, check to make sure nothing's sitting there and add and match as needed. Resolve discrepancies from the last reconcile. Hopefully, this isn't necessary. Hopefully, everybody has kept the ducks in a row, so to speak, and there's nothing strange going on there. But if somebody did make changes to the last reconcile, it will alert you when you go into that tool. There is a discrepancy report that you can use to resolve, and we will take a look at that towards the end here. Entering statement details. Going to take a look at that monthly statement, pull the statement ending date and balance off of it. For connected accounts, so the ones that we actually are bringing transactions in from the bank, you don't have to enter the fees and interest earned because we know all those fees and interest earned for these accounts from the bank feed itself. So you won't have to double enter those. If you're doing manual entry of transactions, you're not using the bank feed, then you would want to enter that stuff in as you go through and reconcile, pull the details from the statement. And then it's a process of verifying transactions and completing. So we're reviewing everything. I'll show you how you can use the filter to narrow down your results. And of course, when the difference becomes 0, we finish the reconciliation. For credit card accounts, it prompts you to pay the bill if you want to do that at that point. And we can review and print the reports if desired. So if you are signed in as an accountant, your Reconcile tool is found under the Accountant Toolbox. You could also go into accounting, and there's a spot to reconcile from here as a tab next to your chart of accounts. And you can also get there from the gear menu. So a lot of different spots to find reconcile depending on where your brain decides to look. The main reconcile page will have us choose the account and enter our ending balance and ending date here. So I would get my bank statement from my client and enter those details. So I've just got something here to make sure this works well. And let's see. Hold on. Let me make sure I'm doing the right account. I was doing the wrong one. It's like that number doesn't look like it did earlier today. All right, so make sure you're reconciling the right bank account for your client. And your statement ending date. So you will see the last statement ending date, and that was my clue that I had the wrong one going on here. So this was August 17th. And pay no mind to these dates. I know they might vary depending on if it's a personal account or business or what have you. Okay, so we're going to start reconciling. So this is an account that I went through and added all the transactions in from the bank feed earlier today. And those got marked as cleared, right? So when I go in to reconcile, they're already checked off because they're already cleared. Now, if I really wanted to go through this line by line, I could click this top circle and select all and then unselect or go back, whatever it prompts here. It looks like there's a couple of things that weren't cleared that were in the register that it didn't check off. So you can select all, go back, or unselect all. By default, we're also going to show this tool based off of the statement ending date. So if I click this X, it'll actually clear that out and show me everything that's in this account. I can go under the filter here if I want to fine-tune even further. I love the filter because I can search by memo, reference number, dollar amount, a dollar amount greater than or less than. I can choose the statuses, transaction types, payees, again, the date here, set a specific date range if I want, and really fine-tune what I'm looking at. But by default, it'll show it of the statement ending date. And then in the center, we have the option to toggle between just looking at the payments, just looking at the deposits, or seeing everything on one window. And if you've been with QuickBooks Online for a while, you'll know that we used to split those and kind of have a split screen view of it. One of the primary reasons that we changed that is, number one, every bank statement is a little different in how they lay that out. But number two, it enabled us to add even more columns so that you can see more details of these transactions from the Reconcile window. So if I go under the small gear in Reconcile, I actually can turn on and off some of these columns. Like I don't really need the reference number perhaps, or maybe I do. It looks like I've got one with that. But I can hide and add some of these things. Now I really like having the memo because like I said, I have the bank detail copy to the memo, so it really helps me make sure that if my client has not been entering in payees as they add things from the bank feed, that I actually have the opportunity to click onto this transaction and add the payee from here, for example. If I am working with transactions that were manually entered, I could do some edits and adjustments from here too to edit the transaction without having to actually open it up or go into the register to do this. So you can actually do some of this stuff right from the Reconcile workflow, which I like. But I'm going to be bad and leave some of these payees blank. I know it'll mess up my reports later, but test account. We'll fix it if we need to. So we don't have a lot to do here, right? Because we know these transactions happened at the bank. We know there's a couple of things sitting in here that I probably need to look at and make sure that they are wonky. You know, maybe they were accidentally coded to the wrong bank account and they shouldn't even be here. So long as all these details match up along the top to what I'm looking at on the bank statement and everything down here looks correct next to the bank statement, I should have a $0 difference and be able to finish now, save for later if I want to give this a second glance, or close without saving if I'd like to start over. But I'm going to finish now because this looks good to me. And then I have the option to open the report right away or click Done. Speaking of reports, those sit up here. We can go into Summary to see all of our bank accounts that we've reconciled so far, when their last statement ending date was, and the last time they were reconciled. I know a number of accountants like having this as something that they export out or print that they give to their client to show this is the work that we've completed for you. History by account is where you get into a lot more detail. We would choose the bank account that we'd like to look at the history for, the reporting period, and then we can tab down to look at each year. So we've got 2 years worth of reconciles here. We can collapse and expand. Ending balance will show here, any adjustments, any changes. We can review these reports, print them, and then as accountant users, you've got to be signed in as an accountant to see this. You'd have the option to undo a past reconciliation. Client's not going to see that drop-down option. All right, so discrepancies and changes. We're going to pretend to be a bad client right now. We're going to go in and change something that's already been reconciled. So we're going to just pick one of these because I want to give you a sense of what that report will look like if we change something. All right. Being a bad client, and I'm changing this amount. You're all going to see me do it. Now, it's telling me, hey, this is going to cause a problem if you do this. And we all know that client that'll say, do it anyway. It's telling me that this transaction has already been reconciled if we do this, and I'm going to do it anyway. If you don't want your clients to do it anyway, it might be a good idea to consider setting up a closing date and password in the accountant settings under the gear. You can go into the accountant settings. It's under advanced. I know many accountants that in QuickBooks Online, they treat that closing date less like an official closing date for the fiscal year and more just a close for a period. So after they go through and do their monthly reconciliations, they might set up a closing date so that if the client tries to change something like this, they'll get prompted to enter a password. And maybe you make it something like $5,000 so that when the client asks for the password and you tell them that, you say, hey, that's how much it's going to cost to fix whatever you're about to do. I know that's an old joke, but still relevant. But let's say that we did make a change here. When we look at the report, it's going to show us that dollar amount that changed. Furthermore, when we go to reconcile the next time, it will tell us that our beginning balance is off, in this case by $1. We can help you fix it. You might think, I'm an accountant, I don't need QuickBooks to help me fix it, but I'm going to encourage you to click on that. And the reason is because this is QuickBooks Online's reconciliation discrepancy report, and it's really great. My favorite thing about it is it actually will tell you what happened and give you the link to the audit log to see who did it. So in this case, you all witnessed me do it. We changed a dollar amount, so it tells me what it was when it was reconciled, what it is now, that difference, that the amount changed, And I can click on this view history, and it will open up my audit log in another tab and show every single edit that's taken place. Now, I've got a lot of entries here because I was doing a lot of wonky things earlier today in my test account. But the important thing here is that it actually is going to show me what took place. It highlights that change. This is in the audit log whenever a transaction is edited in QuickBooks Online. But I can click compare to see those changes over time as well. So at 3/21, that was $10.99. At 3/23, Valerie Heckman made it $9.99. And we can maybe click that up and resolve that, right, to actually change it back. When I'm in that discrepancy report, I can also click on it from here instead if I wanted to change it back. So of course you want to make sure you know what you're doing when you're making these kinds of changes, but that'll clear out this report and we'll be ready to reconcile when the time comes in September. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. One last little note on the reconcile report, and then I'll look to see if there's any questions. In addition to dollar amounts changing, if something was deleted after it was reconciled, it will also show up in that report. If it was changed in the register or account history, you'll see it there, and then if it was unreconciled in the register. If somebody changed something from like an R to a C or to no status, you'll also see those things in that report.